The dust rose in copper plumes behind the wheels of the banker's carriage as it pulled away from the ranch house, leaving Rebecca standing on the warped porch boards with a foreclosure notice crumpled in her fist and 30 days to save everything her late husband had built. The sun beat down mercilessly on the parched Texas earth, and she could see in the distance where her cattle stood skeletal and listless, their ribs showing through their hides like the bars of a prison she couldn't escape. Del Rio in the summer of 1883 was a harsh mistress, and Rebecca had learned that lesson well in the 2 years since Thomas had died. The cholera had taken him quick, leaving her at 24 with a ranch that had been struggling even before his death, creditors who circled like vultures, and a daughter barely old enough to understand why Papa wasn't coming home anymore. Sarah was 6 now, and Rebecca would be damned if she let the bank take the only home her daughter had ever known. She walked back into the house, her boots echoing on the wooden floors that needed polish she couldn't afford. The furniture was sparse, most of it sold off months ago to pay the feed bill that had come due. The kitchen table where Thomas had proposed to her father all those years ago still remained, scarred and worn but solid. She spread the notice out on its surface and read it again, though the words hadn't changed since the first reading or the 10th. "Mama," Sarah's voice came from the doorway, small and uncertain. "It's all right, baby," Rebecca said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Just some business to take care of. Is the ranch going to be okay?" Rebecca looked at her daughter's face, so much like Thomas's with those same gray eyes and stubborn chin, and couldn't bring herself to lie. "I don't know yet, but I'm going to fight for it." That afternoon, she rode into town on their remaining horse, a bay mare named Copper who had seen better days but still had heart. The main street of Del Rio stretched out dusty and crowded, with cowboys and merchants and women in their afternoon dresses moving between the storefronts. Rebecca tied Copper outside the general store and went in, the bell above the door announcing her arrival. Martin Pierce looked up from behind the counter, his expression immediately guarded. She owed him money too, nearly $300 for supplies she'd bought on credit over the past year. "Mrs. Ann," he said, his tone carefully neutral, "Mr. Pierce, I need to post something on your board." She had written it out at home, her handwriting neat despite her shaking hands. "I'm looking to hire on help. Someone willing to work for room and board until I can get the ranch profitable again." Pierce's eyebrows rose. "You planning to pay with wishes and moonbeams, because that's about all you've got left." The words stung because they were true, but Rebecca kept her chin up. "I've got land and cattle and water rights. The ranch just needs proper management and enough hands to work it. Once we get the cattle healthy and ready for market, there'll be money to pay wages. That's a mighty big if, Mrs. Ann." But Pierce took the notice anyway and pinned it to the board near the door where others advertised for work or services. "Though I'll tell you straight, most men aren't going to work on promises. Not when they can ride up to one of the big spreads and get actual wages." "Someone will," Rebecca said, with more confidence than she felt. "Someone has to." She left the store and walked down to the land office, where she confirmed what she already knew. The taxes were 6 months overdue. The bank held a note on the property that Thomas had taken out 3 years ago to buy breeding stock, and the interest had piled up like snowdrift. Even if she sold every head of cattle she owned at premium prices, she'd barely cover half of what she owed. The sun was setting by the time she rode back to the ranch, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if she'd had the heart to notice. Sarah met her at the door, and together they made a simple supper of beans and cornbread, stretching what little they had. That night, lying in bed and listening to Sarah's soft breathing from the other room, Rebecca let herself cry for the first time since Thomas's funeral. She cried for the life they'd planned and lost, for the fear of failing her daughter, for the bone-deep exhaustion of trying to hold everything together with nothing but willpower and stubbornness. But when morning came, she dried her eyes and got up to face another day because that was what you did. You kept going until you couldn't anymore. 3 days passed with no response to her notice. Rebecca spent them trying to patch fence posts that were rotting in the ground and hauling water from the creek to the vegetable garden she'd planted near the house. It was hard work for one woman, work that normally took 3 or 4 hands, and she fell into bed each night with her muscles screaming and her hands blistered raw. On the 4th day, a rider appeared on the eastern road. Rebecca was in the corral trying to check the hooves of one of the steers when she saw him coming, a tall figure on a gray horse that moved with the easy gait of an animal well cared for. She straightened up, wiping her hands on her work dress, and waited as he approached. He was younger than she'd expected, probably close to her own age, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes so blue they were startling in his sun-bronzed face. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, denim and leather worn soft with use, and the gun on his hip looked like it had seen regular service. But it was his expression that caught her attention, serious and measuring, like a man who thought before he spoke. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat as he reined in his horse. "Name's Zachary Tate. I saw your notice in town about hiring on help." Rebecca felt a flutter of hope but tamped it down. "Did you read the part about room and board until the ranch turns profitable? No wages until then." "I did." He swung down from his horse with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent more time in the saddle than on the ground. "I'm not looking for wages right now. I'm looking for a stake. A stake, partnership of a sort." Zachary's gaze traveled over the ranch, taking in the sagging barn, the thin cattle, the fields that needed work. "I've got skills and a strong back. You've got land and cattle and a foundation. Together we might make something of this place. When it turns profitable, we split it equal. If I don't work out or you're not satisfied, I'll move on with no hard feelings." It was too good to be true, which meant there had to be a catch. Rebecca crossed her arms over her chest. "Why would you make an offer like that? You could hire on at any of the big spreads and make regular wages." "Because I'm tired of building other men's dreams," Zachary said simply. "I've been cowboying since I was 14 years old, working spreads from here to Montana. I've saved every penny I could, but it's not enough to buy land of my own. This way, maybe I can earn what I couldn't buy." Rebecca studied him, trying to see past the words to the truth underneath. He met her gaze steadily, and she saw something there she recognized, the same hungry determination that had driven Thomas to stake this claim in the first place. The same determination that kept her fighting now. "I can't make promises," she said finally. "The bank's threatening foreclosure. We've got 30 days to come up with enough money to at least cover the immediate debts or we lose everything. Then I'd better get started." Zachary extended his hand. "Do we have a deal, Mrs. Ann?" She hesitated only a moment before taking his hand. His grip was warm and calloused, the handshake of someone who knew hard work. "We have a deal, Mr. Tate, but you should know what you're getting into. The cattle are undernourished, the infrastructure is falling apart, and we're in debt up to our necks." "Good thing I know how to swim," Zachary said, and the hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth made something in Rebecca's chest loosen just a fraction. She showed him the bunkhouse, a small building that had once housed 3 hired hands back when Thomas was alive and the ranch was thriving. It was dusty but intact, with a potbelly stove and a narrow bed that Zachary declared perfectly adequate. He unsaddled his horse, a gray gelding he called Smoke, and turned him into the corral with Copper. "First things first," Zachary said when he returned. "Let's take a full accounting of what we've got and what we need. Can't make a plan without knowing the territory." They spent the rest of the day walking the property. Rebecca showed him the creek that ran through the northern section, fed by springs that ran year-round even in the drought. She showed him the 160 acres that Thomas had proved up on, plus another 80 they'd bought from a neighbor who'd given up and gone back east. She showed him the cattle, 47 head that should have been twice that number, but sickness and hard times had whittled them down. Zachary listened more than he talked, asking questions that showed he knew his business. How long since they'd rotated pastures? When was the last time the cattle had been checked for parasites? What kind of breeding stock had her husband invested in? By the time the sun was setting and Sarah was calling them in for supper, Rebecca felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not hope exactly, but possibility. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. Sarah was shy with Zachary at first, hanging back behind her mother's skirts and peeking around with wide eyes. But Zachary didn't push, just nodded at her politely and complimented the biscuits she'd helped make. And by the end of the meal, Sarah was chattering away about her doll, and the kittens in the barn, and how Mama said she could learn to ride properly when she got bigger. After Sarah was in bed, Rebecca and Zachary sat at the kitchen table and made their plans by lamplight. "The cattle need better grazing," Zachary said, sketching a rough map of the property on the back of an old feed bill. "If we move them up to the north pasture near the creek, they'll have better access to water and the grass is longer there. It'll mean fixing the fence line, but that's doable." "The fence posts are half rotted," Rebecca said. "Then we'll replace them. There's timber up in the hills we can harvest." "It'll take time, but time is what we've got." Zachary tapped the pencil against the table. "The bigger problem is getting these cattle healthy enough to sell. They're too thin to bring good prices right now, and we can't afford to wait months for them to fatten up naturally. What do you suggest?" "There's good grazing about 20 miles north of here, land that belongs to the government. It's free range, open to anyone who wants to use it. If we drive the cattle up there for the rest of the summer, let them put on weight, we could have them ready for the fall market. The prices are better then anyway, once the northern buyers start coming through." Rebecca considered it. "That would mean leaving the ranch unattended, not if one of us stays behind." Zachary met her eyes across the table. "I can manage the drive with maybe one more hand, someone we can hire on for day wages. You stay here with your daughter, keep the home place running. When we come back, we'll have cattle worth selling." It made sense, but the thought of trusting her entire herd to a man she'd known for less than a day made Rebecca's stomach clench. Still, what choice did she have? If they didn't do something, they'd lose everything anyway. "All right," she said, "but we do this smart. We get everything in writing, a proper partnership agreement, and we find a hand you trust to help with the drive. Fair enough." Zachary stood and stretched, his shoulders rolling with the motion. "I'll ride into town tomorrow and see about hiring someone, and Mrs. Ann. Thank you for taking a chance on me." After he'd gone back to the bunkhouse, Rebecca sat alone in the kitchen and wondered if she'd just made the best decision of her life or the worst mistake. Only time would tell. The next week passed in a blur of hard work. Zachary proved to be everything he'd claimed and more, up before dawn and working until dark, his hands never idle. He repaired the barn door that had been hanging crooked for 6 months, replaced a dozen fence posts, and somehow coaxed the old windmill back into working order so they had water pumping into the trough again. Rebecca worked beside him when she could, though she also had Sarah to care for and the household to manage. She found herself watching Zachary sometimes, noticing the efficient way he moved, the patience he showed with the animals, the quiet competence that came from years of experience. He didn't talk much about his past, but she pieced together bits of his story through casual conversation. He'd been born in Kansas, left home young after his parents died of fever, worked his way south through a dozen different ranches. He'd never married, never stayed in one place long enough to put down roots. Always figured I'd find my own piece of land someday, he said one afternoon as they worked side by side replacing fence rails. But good land isn't cheap, and honest work doesn't pay enough to buy it. When I saw your notice, it seemed like maybe fate was giving me a chance. Fate or desperation, Rebecca said, hammering a nail into place. Sometimes they're the same thing. Zachary handed her another nail. You're doing a good job here, Mrs. Ann. Keeping this place going on your own, taking care of your daughter. Your husband would be proud. The words shouldn't have meant as much as they did, but Rebecca felt her throat tighten anyway. Thomas wanted to build something lasting, a legacy for Sarah. I can't let that die with him. It won't, Zachary said, and there was a quiet certainty in his voice that made her want to believe him. Zachary found his extra hand in a Mexican cowboy named Juan Ramirez, who'd worked with him 2 years back on a spread in the Panhandle. Juan was older, probably 40 or so, with a weathered face and steady hands. He agreed to work the drive for fair wages and seemed pleased to be reunited with Zachary. He is a good man, Juan told Rebecca in accented English, gesturing at Zachary. Fair boss, works hard. You are lucky to have him. We're partners, Rebecca corrected. Equal stake in the ranch. Juan's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. Even better. Partners who work together build strong foundations. They spent 2 days preparing for the drive, checking hooves and sorting out which cattle were strong enough to make the journey. In the end, they decided to take all but 5 head, leaving the weakest animals behind for Rebecca to tend. It was a risk, putting everything on this one gamble, but calculated risk was better than slow, certain failure. The morning they left, the sun was just breaking over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Sarah stood on the porch holding Rebecca's hand, watching as Zachary and Juan gathered the cattle and started them moving north. Zachary rained smoke over to the porch, looking down at them. We'll be back in 6 weeks, maybe 8 if the grazing is particularly good. You need anything, Martin Pierce in town knows where we're headed. Be careful, Rebecca said, and meant it more than she'd expected to. Always am. Zachary touched his hat brim, his blue eyes meeting hers for a long moment. Then he wheeled Smoke around and rode after the cattle, and Rebecca stood watching until they disappeared into the heat shimmer of the morning. The ranch felt empty with them gone. Rebecca threw herself into work to keep from worrying, tending the vegetable garden and the remaining cattle, making repairs to the house that she'd been putting off. Sarah helped where she could, chattering away to fill the silence, and at night they sat on the porch in the cooling air and Rebecca told her daughter stories about her father, keeping his memory alive. 3 weeks into the drive, a man rode up to the ranch in the late afternoon. Rebecca was in the garden pulling weeds when she heard the hoofbeats and looked up to see a stranger on a black horse, watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with unease. She stood slowly, wiping her hands on her apron, very aware that she was alone except for Sarah, who was playing in the house. "Can I help you?" The man was well dressed for a cowboy, his clothes too clean and his boots too expensive. His face was handsome in a hard way, with cold, dark eyes that assessed her like she was livestock at auction. "Mrs. Ann, I'm Clayton Worth. I believe you know my employer, Harold Blackstone, at the bank." Rebecca's hands tightened on her apron. Mr. Blackstone sent you, in a manner of speaking. I'm here to make you an offer. Clayton dismounted, moving closer than was proper. Mr. Blackstone is prepared to forgive your debts entirely if you sign over the deed to this property. You'd have enough money to start fresh somewhere else, maybe go back east where life is easier for a woman alone. I'm not selling. Mrs. Ann, be reasonable. You can't possibly think you can make this ranch profitable. You're just delaying the inevitable. I have a partner now, Rebecca said, standing her ground. We're working the cattle, getting them ready for market. We'll have the money to pay what we owe. Clayton's expression hardened. This partner of yours, Zachary Tate, I've asked around about him. Drifter, works a season here and there, never stays anywhere long. What makes you think he's going to come back instead of selling your cattle and keeping the money? The words hit like a punch because they voiced the fear Rebecca had been trying not to acknowledge. She knew almost nothing about Zachary except what he'd told her. What if Clayton was right? What if this whole thing had been an elaborate con? Get off my property, she said, her voice shaking with anger and fear. I'm trying to help you, Clayton said. But if you want to wait until the bank forecloses and you lose everything, that's your choice. Just remember I made you a fair offer. He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Rebecca standing in the garden with her heart pounding and doubt creeping in like poison. That night she barely slept, tossing and turning as her mind spun through worst-case scenarios. What if Zachary didn't come back? What if she'd been a fool to trust him? But when morning came and she walked out to check on the remaining cattle, she saw all the work Zachary had done. The repaired fences and the working windmill and the barn door that hung straight on its hinges. A man planning to cheat her wouldn't have put in that kind of effort. Would he? The weeks crawled by. Rebecca worked herself to exhaustion each day so she wouldn't have energy to worry at night. She began riding into town once a week to check on news, hoping to hear something about the drive or cattle sales, or anything that would tell her Zachary was where he said he'd be. Martin Pierce was slightly less hostile now, perhaps sensing her desperation. Haven't heard anything about any trouble up north, he told her during one visit. No reports of rustling or stampedes. That's good news, Mrs. Ann. It was something, at least. 7 weeks after Zachary and Juan had left, Rebecca was hanging laundry when she saw dust on the northern horizon. Her heart leaped into her throat, and she shaded her eyes against the sun, watching as the dust cloud resolved into riders and cattle, more cattle than she remembered sending, their coats glossy in the afternoon light. Zachary rode at the front, Smoke's gray coat dark with sweat, but the horse still moving strong. When he saw Rebecca standing by the clothesline, his face broke into a grin that transformed his usually serious expression. Mrs. Ann, he called as he rode up, permission to bring your cattle home. Relief hit her so hard she felt dizzy with it. Permission granted, Mr. Tate. The cattle looked transformed, their ribs no longer showing, their movements energetic instead of listless. Juan rode around from the back of the herd, also grinning, and together the two men drove the animals into the corral. That evening, after Juan had been paid and had ridden off toward town, Rebecca and Zachary sat on the porch while Sarah played in the yard, and Zachary told her about the drive. The grazing was even better than I'd hoped, he said. Rich grass and plenty of water. The cattle put on weight fast and we didn't lose a single head. Better yet, I talked to some buyers who will be coming through Del Rio in 3 weeks for the fall market. They're interested in what we've got. How much do you think we can get? Zachary named a figure that made Rebecca's breath catch. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to pay off the banknote, cover the back taxes, and have money left over for operating expenses through the winter. Are you sure? She asked, afraid to believe it. I'm sure. These are good cattle, Mrs. Ann. Your husband knew what he was doing when he bought the breeding stock. They just needed proper care and good grazing. Zachary leaned back against the porch post, looking out over the ranch as the sun set. We're going to make this work. We might actually save the ranch, Rebecca said softly, and felt tears prick at her eyes. We will save the ranch, Zachary corrected gently. You're a fighter, Mrs. Ann. I knew that the first time I saw you trying to check that steer's hooves all by yourself. Most women in your situation would have given up, but not you. I didn't have a choice. Everyone has a choice. You chose to fight. Zachary's blue eyes were warm in the fading light. That takes courage. Rebecca felt her cheeks heat and looked away, suddenly very aware of how close he was sitting, how his presence had become comfortable and familiar over the weeks they'd worked together. It had been so long since Thomas died, so long since she'd thought of herself as anything other than a widow struggling to survive. But sitting here with Zachary in the gentle evening air, she felt something stirring that she'd thought was dead, a flutter of attraction and possibility. She stood abruptly. I should get Sarah ready for bed. Thank you for bringing the cattle back safely. If Zachary noticed her sudden awkwardness, he was kind enough not to mention it. Good night, Mrs. Ann. The 3 weeks before the cattle sale felt both endless and too short. Rebecca and Zachary worked together to get the animals in top condition, grooming them until their coats gleamed, making sure they were well fed and watered. Zachary also made a trip to the bank, arranging for the funds from the sale to be held in trust until all the debts were settled. I want everything legal and proper, he told Rebecca. No room for anyone to claim we did something wrong. Harold Blackstone was displeased to see Zachary at the bank, his expression souring when Zachary laid out their plans. But the banker couldn't refuse to accept payment, even if it meant losing the opportunity to foreclose and sell the land to one of his cronies for a profit. The day of the sale, buyers came from as far as San Antonio and Fort Worth, rough men who knew cattle and weren't easily impressed. But when they saw the herd Zachary and Rebecca were offering, their eyes lit with interest. The bidding was competitive, driving the price up even higher than Zachary had projected. When it was over and the cattle were loaded into stock cars bound for the northern markets, Rebecca held a bank draft in her hands that represented more money than she'd seen in her entire life. Her hands were shaking. We did it, she whispered. You did it, Zachary said. This is your ranch, Mrs. Ann, your dream. Our ranch, Rebecca corrected, meeting his eyes. Our dream now, that was the deal. They paid off the bank note that very afternoon, Rebecca taking fierce pleasure in handing the money directly to Harold Blackstone and watching his face go red with suppressed anger. They paid the back taxes and settled her account with Martin Pierce at the general store. When everything was settled, they still had enough left to buy supplies for the winter and start rebuilding the herd. That night, Rebecca cooked a proper celebration dinner, fried chicken and mashed potatoes and apple pie made with the last of the preserved fruit from the previous year. Sarah was giddy with excitement, talking nonstop about all the things they could do now that they weren't poor anymore. After Sarah was in bed, Rebecca and Zachary sat at the kitchen table with coffee, both of them tired but satisfied. What now? Rebecca asked. We've saved the ranch, but we need to plan for the future. We can't live sale to sale. We rebuild the herd, Zachary said. Buy breeding stock, maybe 20 good heifers and a quality bull. With the land and water we have, we could support a herd of 200 head eventually. We diversify too, maybe raise some horses. There's always a market for good riding stock. That would take years. Building something worthwhile always does. Zachary turned his coffee cup in his hands. Unless you'd rather I moved on now that the crisis is over. I'd understand if you wanted to run things on your own. No, Rebecca said quickly, then felt herself blush at her own urgency. I mean, we're partners. Equal stake, remember? I'd like you to stay if you want to. I want to, Zachary said, and his voice was warm with something that made Rebecca's heart beat faster. I've never wanted anything more. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and Rebecca found herself studying his face in the lamplight, the strong lines of his jaw and the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. She realized with a start that she'd been noticing him more and more lately, finding excuses to work near him, looking forward to their evening conversations on the porch. It had been happening so gradually that she hadn't recognized it for what it was until this moment. She was falling in love with him. The realization should have frightened her, but instead it felt right, like something settling into place. Thomas would always have a part of her heart, but he was gone, and life moved forward whether you wanted it to or not. Zachary was here, solid and real, and looking at her with an expression that suggested maybe, just maybe, he felt the same way. Zachary, she said softly, and watched his eyes widen slightly at her use of his first name. She'd been calling him Mr. Tate for months out of propriety, but suddenly that seemed absurd. I need to tell you something. I'm listening. She took a breath, gathering her courage. When you first came here, I thought you were just another drifter looking for easy opportunity. I was suspicious and guarded and probably not very welcoming. But you proved me wrong. You worked harder than anyone I've ever known. You treated Sarah with kindness, and you kept every promise you made. You saved this ranch, saved my daughter's future, and I can never thank you enough for that. Rebecca, Zachary said, and the sound of her name in his deep voice made her shiver. You don't owe me thanks. This place, working beside you, watching you fight for what's yours, it's given me something I've never had before, purpose. A home. A reason to stop drifting and start building. Is that all? Rebecca asked, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. Zachary stood and came around the table, kneeling beside her chair so they were eye level. No, that's not all. Somewhere between fixing fences and driving cattle and sitting on the porch in the evening listening to you tell Sarah stories, I fell in love with you. I know it's too soon. I know you're still grieving your husband, and I swear I'll never push or pressure you. But you asked, and I won't lie to you. I love you, Rebecca Ann. Tears spilled down Rebecca's cheeks, but they were happy tears. It's not too soon. I've been grieving for 2 years, and Thomas wouldn't want me to spend the rest of my life alone. I think he'd like you, actually. You're the same kind of man he was, honorable and hard-working and good. And I love you too, Zachary Tate. I think I have for a while now. I was just too scared to admit it. Zachary cupped her face in his calloused hands, his thumb wiping away her tears. Don't be scared. I'm not going anywhere. I'm home. When he kissed her, it was gentle and sweet and full of promise. Rebecca melted into it, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, and felt something in her chest that had been locked tight since Thomas died finally open up again. It wasn't betrayal to move forward. It was survival. It was choosing life and hope and love even when the world tried to beat you down. They pulled apart eventually, both breathing hard, and Zachary rested his forehead against hers. I want to do this right, he said. Court you properly, ask for your hand the way you deserve. Will you let me? Yes, Rebecca whispered. But Zachary, you should know that Sarah comes with me. We're a package deal. Good, Zachary said, grinning. I happen to think your daughter is pretty great, though I should warn you I know nothing about raising children. Lucky for you, I'm an excellent teacher. They laughed together, and Rebecca felt lighter than she had in years. Over the next few months, the ranch began to truly flourish. They bought breeding stock with the remainder of their funds, good quality heifers and a massive longhorn bull that Zachary named Ferdinand, despite his fearsome horns. They repaired the bunkhouse and hired on 2 permanent hands, young cowboys eager for steady work and willing to learn. Zachary courted Rebecca with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else. He brought her wildflowers from the hills and helped Sarah learn to ride on a gentle mare they bought specifically for her. He sat with Rebecca on the porch every evening, talking about their plans for the ranch and sharing stories from his past. He was patient and respectful, never pushing for more than she was ready to give, and that patience only made Rebecca love him more. 6 months after they'd met, on a cool December evening with the stars bright overhead, Zachary got down on one knee in front of the whole ranch, Hans and Sarah included, and asked Rebecca to marry him. The ring was simple, a thin gold band with a small chip of turquoise, and Rebecca thought it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. "Yes," she said, pulling him up to kiss him while Sarah cheered and the cowboys whistled and clapped. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married in the Del Rio church. 2 weeks later, a small ceremony with Sarah standing as flower girl, and Juan Ramirez giving Rebecca away since her own father had passed years before. Rebecca wore the same dress she'd married Thomas in, altered and freshened up, and she felt no guilt about it. Thomas was part of her history, but Zachary was her future, and both deserved to be honored. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Zachary kissed her thoroughly enough to make the congregation laugh, and Sarah cover her eyes in pretend embarrassment. Walking back down the aisle with her hand in Zachary's, Rebecca felt a contentment she hadn't known was possible after so much loss. The ranch became officially known as the Tate Ranch, with both their names on the new deed. They built it together over the next few years, expanding the herd and the acreage, developing a reputation for quality cattle and fair dealing. Sarah grew from a shy 6-year-old into a confident young woman who could ride and rope as well as any of the hands. She called Zachary Papa within a year of the marriage, and watching them together, seeing how he taught her with patience and pride, made Rebecca fall in love with him all over again. 2 years after the wedding, Rebecca gave birth to a son. They named him Thomas after Rebecca's first husband, and Zachary held the tiny red-faced baby with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "He's perfect," Zachary whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You're perfect. I don't know what I did to deserve this, but thank God I saw that notice in the general store." "We deserve each other," Rebecca said, watching her husband cradle their son. "We both fought for this, Zachary, for the ranch, for our family, for this life. We earned it." 3 years after Thomas came Emma, a dark-haired girl with her father's blue eyes and her mother's stubborn determination. Then, 2 years later came William, completing their family. The ranch house that had felt so empty after Thomas's death now rang with children's laughter and the chaos of family life. Sarah, nearly grown at 15, helped care for her younger siblings with the same competence she brought to ranch work. She was planning to attend a teaching college in San Antonio, though she promised to come home summers to help with the work. Watching her daughter prepare to step into her own future, Rebecca felt proud and grateful and slightly melancholy all at once. "She's going to do great things," Zachary said one evening, finding Rebecca on the porch where she often sat thinking. "I know, I'm so proud of her, but I'll miss her terribly. She'll come back. This is her home, same as it's ours." Zachary settled into the chair beside her, taking her hand. "We built something good here, Rebecca, something lasting." "We did," Rebecca agreed, squeezing his fingers. "Remember when I was so suspicious of you? I actually worried you might steal my cattle and disappear." Zachary laughed. "I remember. You watched me like a hawk those first few weeks." "Can't say I blamed you, though. You'd been through hell, and here comes some stranger offering help that seemed too good to be true. Best gamble I ever took. Second best, Zachary corrected. The best was fighting to keep this ranch in the first place. You're the strongest person I know, Rebecca. You always were. They sat together watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant colors, their younger children playing in the yard under the watchful eye of one of the hands. The cattle were fat and healthy in the pastures, the buildings were sturdy and well-maintained, and the accounts showed a comfortable profit for the third year running. It was everything Rebecca had fought for, and more than she dared to hope. 10 years after that desperate day when the banker had handed her the foreclosure notice, Rebecca stood on the same porch and surveyed her kingdom. The ranch had tripled in size, their reputation extending across 3 states. They employed 15 hands year-round and took on extras during roundup and drives. Sarah had graduated from teaching college and returned home to start a school for ranch children, teaching out of a building they'd constructed specifically for that purpose. Thomas Jr. was 8 and already showing signs of being a natural cattleman like his father. Emma at 5 was fearless, climbing everything and declaring her intention to be a cowboy when she grew up. William at 3 followed his older brother everywhere, a sweet-natured shadow. Zachary came up behind her, his arms circling her waist, and she leaned back against his chest with a contentment that had become familiar over the years. "Happy," he murmured against her hair. "Deliriously," Rebecca said. "Though I never could have imagined this life back when I was trying to hold things together alone. You were never going to lose this place. You had too much fight in you. Maybe. But I would have lost so much more if you hadn't walked into my life." She turned in his arms to face him. "Thank you for being brave enough to take a chance on a desperate widow with a failing ranch. Thank you for being brave enough to trust a drifting cowboy with nothing but dreams." Zachary kissed her softly. "Though I'd argue I got the better end of this deal. I got you, Sarah, our children, this life. That's more than I ever hoped for." That evening, they gathered the whole family for supper around the big table Zachary had built to replace the old scarred one Rebecca couldn't quite bring herself to get rid of. Both tables sat in the enlarged kitchen now, symbols of past and present existing together. Sarah talked about her students, Thomas demonstrated his latest rope trick, Emma declared that broccoli was an abomination, and William fell asleep in his plate before dessert. It was chaotic and loud and perfect. After the children were in bed, Rebecca and Zachary walked out to check on the horses like they did most nights. The barn was lit with lanterns, and the smell of hay and leather was comforting and familiar. Smoke, now gray-muzzled and retired from hard work, nickered softly when Zachary approached his stall. "Old friend," Zachary said, stroking the gelding's nose. "You brought me home, didn't you? Best day's ride of my life." "Mine too," Rebecca said, standing beside him. "I was so scared that morning. Scared that I'd made a terrible decision, that you'd disappear with my cattle, that I'd lose everything. Clayton Worth had been here just days before, putting doubts in my head." "Whatever happened to Worth anyway?" Zachary asked. "Last I heard, he was in prison for cattle rustling. Turns out he'd been working both sides, taking money from the bank to pressure people into selling, then rustling their cattle before they could get to market. He targeted the wrong ranch and got caught. Good riddance." Zachary put his arm around Rebecca's shoulders. "You know what I think about sometimes? What would have happened if I hadn't seen that notice? What if I'd ridden through Del Rio a day earlier or a day later? We might never have met." "I don't believe that," Rebecca said. "I think we were meant to find each other. The timing, the circumstances, all of it happened exactly the way it needed to. You needed a stake, I needed help, and together we built something neither of us could have managed alone." Is that your romantic side talking, Mrs. Tate? Maybe. But it's also the truth. She smiled up at him. Besides, you're stuck with me now. Partnership agreement, remember? Equal stake. Best contract I ever signed, Zachary said, and kissed her under the barn lights while the horses dozed and the night settled peaceful around them. The years continued to roll forward, bringing their share of challenges and triumphs. There were droughts that tested their water management and hard winters that pushed their resources. There were good years when the cattle brought premium prices and lean years when they had to tighten their belts and make do. Through it all, Rebecca and Zachary worked side by side, their partnership as strong in their 20th year of marriage as it had been in their first. Sarah married a lawyer from San Antonio, a good man who respected her independence and supported her teaching. They settled on a piece of land adjacent to the ranch, building their own home while staying close to family. Thomas Jr. took to ranch management like he'd been born for it, learning everything Zachary could teach him and adding innovations of his own. Emma shocked everyone by going to veterinary school, one of the first women to do so, and returned to establish a practice serving the ranches throughout the region. William discovered a talent for breeding and became known throughout Texas for producing quality stock. The ranch passed through Rebecca's 50th birthday and then her 60th, the years marking themselves in silver threads in her hair and laugh lines around her eyes. Zachary aged beside her, his dark hair going gray and then white, his movements a bit slower but his spirit unchanged. They became the patriarch and matriarch of a sprawling family, grandchildren running through the ranch house the way their children once had. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered for a celebration. The house was full to bursting, 3 generations crowded around tables set up in the yard under strings of lanterns. There was music and dancing and more food than they could possibly eat. As the evening grew late and the younger grandchildren were carried off to bed, Rebecca found herself on the porch again, watching her family with a heart so full it almost hurt. Zachary found her there, like he always did, and pulled her into a slow dance even though the music had stopped. 25 years, he murmured. Has it really been that long? Feels like yesterday sometimes. Other times it feels like we've always been together. Rebecca rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. I love you, Zachary Tate. More now than I did on our wedding day, and I loved you quite a lot then. I love you too. You're everything to me, Rebecca. This ranch, our children, all of it is wonderful, but you're what matters most. You're my home. They swayed together in the darkness, and Rebecca thought about the terrified widow she'd been, standing on this same porch with a foreclosure notice and no hope in sight. She thought about the cowboy who'd ridden into her life offering his back and his name and a partnership that had become so much more. She thought about all the years between then and now, the struggles and the victories, the children raised and the legacy built. We did good, didn't we? She said softly. We did better than good, Zachary replied. We did exactly what we set out to do. We saved the ranch, built a life, created something lasting. Your first husband would be proud, Rebecca. He'd be glad you didn't give up, glad you found happiness again. I think so too. Rebecca lifted her head to look at her husband, the man who'd chosen to stake his future on hers when she had nothing to offer but debt and determination. Thank you for taking that chance all those years ago. Thank you for every day since. Thank you for letting me, Zachary said, and kissed her with the same tenderness he always had, the same love that had carried them through 25 years and would carry them through however many more they had. The ranch continued to prosper under their guidance and eventually under Thomas Jr.'s management as Rebecca and Zachary gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operations. They spent their later years as advisors and grandparents, passing on their knowledge while enjoying the fruits of their long labor. The Tate Ranch became one of the most respected operations in Texas, known not just for quality cattle but for fair dealing and ethical practices. Rebecca lived to see her great-grandchildren running through the house where she'd once feared to lose everything. She watched the ranch expand to over 2,000 acres, supporting hundreds of head of cattle and a thriving horse breeding program. She saw her children successful and happy, her grandchildren growing strong, and her legacy secure. On a warm spring evening in 1925, 42 years after a desperate widow had posted a notice for help, Rebecca sat on the porch with Zachary, their hands intertwined as they'd been for over 4 decades. The sunset was particularly beautiful, and the ranch spread before them in peaceful prosperity. "Did you ever imagine this?" Rebecca asked, her voice soft with age but still strong. "When you rode up that first day, did you imagine we'd build all this?" "I imagined possibility," Zachary said. "I saw a woman who refused to quit, land with potential, and a chance to finally stop drifting. But this," he gestured at the thriving ranch, the distant sounds of family inside the house, "this exceeded my wildest dreams." "Mine too," Rebecca said. "I thought I was just trying to save a ranch. I didn't know I was saving my own life." "We saved each other," Zachary corrected. "That's what partners do." They sat together as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars appeared. Two people who'd gambled everything on each other, and one more than they'd dared to hope. The ranch they'd fought so hard to save would outlive them both, passing through generations, but the love they'd built would be its true foundation, the real legacy they left behind. The widow, who'd had nothing but debt and determination, had found everything she needed in a cowboy willing to offer his back and his name. Together they'd built not just a ranch, but a dynasty, not just a partnership, but a love story for the ages. And as Rebecca leaned against Zachary's shoulder, watching the stars come out over the land they'd made their own, she knew that every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of fear and doubt had been worth it for this, for the life they'd created and the love they'd found. The story that began with a desperate notice and a cowboy's gamble ended decades later with a legacy that would endure for generations. A testament to what two people could build when they refused to give up on each other, or the dream they shared. The ranch stood strong, the family thrived, and the love between Rebecca Ann and Zachary Tate remained the bedrock on which everything else was built, proving that sometimes the best things in life come from taking a chance on someone willing to stake everything on a shared future.